Hello everybody. In this video, we're going to take a look at the connection editor and also dabble a little bit in utilities in Maya. You'll remember from the previous video from last week, we looked at constraints. And we found constraints under the rigging menu set here. And the way that the constraints worked were that you could select an object, the object that was going to be the one that influences the other object, and then you can shift select the second object as the object that's going to be constrained. And then we can go to constrain and then choose from various different types of constraints, such as a parent constraint, point, orient, scale, aim, etc. I'm going to apply an orient constraint to this so that we can just have a little refresher and see what happens. So this object here, this gear, if we click over here in the outliner, you'll notice that it actually has nested underneath a orient constraint, meaning that it's being controlled, at least its orientation is being controlled by something else. In this case, it's being controlled by this other gear because we just created that orient constraint. In fact, if we open up the channel box, you'll notice also that if I select the gear, that the rotation channels for this object are being controlled by something else other than animation keys. So let's see how this works. If I grab this gear and I rotate it, the other one rotates identically. If I rotate it in other axes as well, it rotates similarly. And that is because it is constrained, because this object is orient constraint to this object here. Now, a orient constraint or the other constraints are really a perfect tool if this is the behavior that you want. If you want it to be basically a one-to-one relationship, so that, for instance, with this gear, if I rotate it 60 degrees, let's say, then this one will also rotate 60 degrees, negative 60 degrees, and it's basically a one-to-one relationship between the two. Whatever I do to the one, it does exactly the same to the other. This, however, is not always the behavior that we want. For instance, if we add these extra gears, then the thing is that you'll notice that this gear here is going to need to rotate in the opposite direction from this one, and it's going to need to rotate faster. So to do that, to accomplish that, we're going to take a look at the connection editor, and we'll take a look at utility nodes. So I'm going to hide these extra gears for the time being, and I'm going to select this gear, and I'm going to show you another way rather than using constraints to accomplish the same thing. In other words, how we can take this gear and rotate it and have this gear rotate exactly the same. So I'm going to select this gear that has the constraint. We'll delete the constraint. Now you can see that this gear is having no effect on this second gear, and we'll look at another way that we can accomplish the same thing, but you're going to see the advantages to this other method for when we need to do some of these other things like reversing a direction or having something rotate faster or slower and so on. So let's begin. First thing I'm going to do is, with this gear selected, I will go to my Windows Animation Editors, or sorry, Windows General Editors Connection Editor. And you'll notice that the connection editor opens and we have two columns. We've got the left and the right side here. Currently, the gear that we have selected now, gear 1, is in this left column, and I'm going to add this second gear to the right column by selecting it and then clicking on Reload Right. So now we have, in this case, gear 1 and gear 3 in the connection editor. And what we can do is, under all these different channels here, a lot of them, we'll take the rotate channel for our first gear, and we'll simply come over here and connect it to the other gear by clicking on the rotate. So now we basically have something identical to what we had in the previous example. So if I select this gear and I rotate it, the other one rotates exactly identically to it. Now the connection editor is actually much more powerful than the constraints in that we can do more than just have a one-to-one relationship with it rotating, for instance, on the z-axis and then rotating the second gear on the z-axis. I'm going to break the connection by clicking on rotate, and I'm going to expand on rotate in both of my columns here. And what I want to show you is how I can connect just the rotate Z to the rotate Z of the other gear. So now if I rotate on Z, they both rotate. But if I rotate on X or I rotate on Y, it actually has no effect on this second gear here. Or perhaps I want the rotate Z of my first gear to affect a different channel on the second gear, and we can do that as well. Let me go ahead and uncheck the rotate Z so that rotate Z of this is no longer affecting the rotate Z of this second gear. And what we'll do is attach the rotate Z of the first gear to the rotate Y of our other gear. So now if I rotate on Z, you'll notice that they both rotate the same number of degrees, but they're rotating in different axes. And we're not limited to having rotates just affect rotates or translates just affecting translates. We can connect those as well. So I'm going to break that connection so that now this rotation is having no effect on the other gear here. I'm going to go to translate and I'm going to select the translate Y for my first gear, and we'll attach that to the rotate Z of the second gear. So now the translate of this gear is going to affect the rotate of this other gear. And let's see what happens when, if I move it in the X, nothing happens. If I move it in the Y, the gear rotates. I'll zoom out so you can see this a little better. Perhaps we want it to affect the scale as well, and we can do that too. So we'll take the translate Y, and for the second gear, we'll have it affect scale. So now you'll see that it's hard to see the rotation happening right now, but it is happening. But you'll see how the scale of the second gear is actually being affected by the translate Y of the first gear. So in fact, we can get very creative with this connection editor because we can make different channels affect other channels on our objects. So let's see how we can use these techniques to make this system, this gear system here, work appropriately. Now, these two gears should both rotate at the same speed and in the same direction in this setup. So I'll select this gear, the first gear. go to my general editor, connection editor, and we're going to be using its rotate Z. We'll select the other gear, the similar sized gear here. We'll reload it on the right, and we'll connect the first gear's rotate Z to this third gear here. So now when we rotate the first gear, the third gear also rotates. Now, this second gear is going to be a little bit more of a challenge because we can't do a direct relationship from one gear to the other. We want it also to rotate on the Z-axis, but it's going to need to rotate twice as fast as these two gears, and it's going to need to rotate in the opposite direction. So let's see how we can accomplish that. Once again, I'm going to select this first gear, and it's going to drive the other gears. It's going to be the one that is controlling the other gears. So I'm going to go to my Windows, General Editors, Connection Editor, and once again, we'll have it loaded on the left. But this time we're not going to directly connect it to this smaller gear. Instead, we're going to create what is called a utility node. And I'll show you how to do that now. So utility nodes can be created in the Hypershade. It may not seem entirely intuitive, considering that the Hypershade is where we primarily work on materials, on our shaders. But this is where you will find the utilities, and they're found here. I'm going to click on utilities. As you can see, there are a number of them to choose from. But the one that we're going to be looking at is this one, the multiply divide utility node. So I'll click on that. Here is our node that we just created. Doesn't look like much, but what we're going to do is load it into the right here of our connection editor. And once again, we're going to take the rotate Z from our first gear, and then we're going to input it into one of these inputs, input 1, input 2. We're going to input that value into one of these. It doesn't really matter which one, as long as we are consistent with how we're working and we know how we're connecting these. But since we're working with a rotate Z, I'm going to put it into the input Z. What you'll notice here in the Hypershade is that we can actually see this connection here. In fact, you can see that there's this connection being created. Now, I just closed my Hypershade. I probably should have left it open. So I'll just reopen it now. And I'm going to select this utility node that I just created, the multiply divide. Notice that you also find them here in this tab here. We've got our utilities here. Whatever we've brought into our scene will also be found under this tab. I've only created one utility so far, and here it is here. So I'm going to select my utility node, and I'm going to load it to the left column because it is now going to be the one driving. And then I'm going to select the smaller gear and load it into the right. Now we're going to go to output, and you'll remember that I input into input Z, so I'm going to select output Z, and I'm going to connect that to the rotate Z of my smaller gear. Now we still have more setup to do. You'll see that if I rotate this right now, what's happening is that it's rotating at the same speed and in the same direction. Now, as we mentioned before, we need that gear, this gear here, to rotate in the opposite direction and for it to rotate twice as fast. So we're going to return to, we can close the connection editor at this point. We're going to return to our multiply divide node and open it up in our attribute editor here. What I'd like you to notice is this, that we have our input 1, it's yellow because we connected this value. This gear here is applying the value in there. Our operation is set to multiply. We do have some additional math operations we can do, such as divide or power. We want to multiply. And what we need to do is make it rotate twice as fast. So I'm going to have the rotation value of this gear multiplied by 2. You'll notice now that if I rotate this, it's rotating twice as fast, but it's still not rotating in the proper direction. If I multiply it by -2, on the other hand, then we get the behavior that we want. We'll move on to the bigger gear now and see if we can get that one working properly. So far we've got first, second, and third gears working correctly, but how will we get this fourth one? Well, the fourth one needs to also rotate in the opposite direction from this gear and this gear. It'll rotate in the same direction as this one, but because this is a bigger gear, we'll need it to rotate more slowly. So let's go through that process now. I could connect this to this gear if I wanted, or this one. It really doesn't matter. We'll go ahead and just be consistent and connect everything to this gear. So what I'm going to do is go to my connection editor. My first gear is loaded into the left column here. We'll go back to our hypershade and create yet another utility node. We'll create another one of the multiply divide nodes found here. I'll select my multiply divide node. I can select it here, or I can select it from the utilities here. Load it into the right column. We'll come over here once again and connect the rotate Z to our input Z. With my node selected, I'm going to load it now to the left column, and we'll select the big gear and load it into the right column. And once again, we'll connect the utility nodes output Z to the rotate Z of the large gear. It's rotating now, but once again, it's rotating in the wrong direction, and in this case, it's rotating too quickly. So let's select its utility node, and this time, instead of multiplying it by 2 or -2, we'll multiply this one by -0.5. That way, the rotation for our first gear, whatever the number is, however many degrees it's been rotated, will be multiplied by -0.5, and then that number will be applied to the rotate Z of our larger gear. And now that's working. So finally, we'll move on to the last gear, the worm gear, which we will also set into motion um, using our first gear here. So this one is a little bit more complicated. Actually, in a sense, it's easier, uh, but it will take a little bit more thought. What we're going to do is connect this gear to that gear. We could, again, if we wanted, we could connect this gear and have it drive this one. Any one of these gears can drive this because they're all working in tandem with one another. We can get it to work. We'll go ahead and stay consistent and continue working with this first gear as the driver. I'm going to go over to my connection editor once again. The first gear is loaded into the left column. We'll go back to our hypershade and we will create another utility, another multiply divide node. We'll select that multiply divide node and load it into the right. And we'll connect our first gears, rotate Z, to one of these input ones. We'll go ahead and stay consistent and go ahead and load it into the input Z for our utility node. Utility node selected, load it to the left, grab our worm gear, load it to the right. And we'll connect the output to the to the input of our worm gear, to the rotate. And let's see what we have here. So obviously that's not what we want. The mistake here is that I have attached the utility node to the rotate Z of the worm gear, and in fact we need it to rotate on the y-axis, sorry, the x-axis. The x-axis is the one that we need to connect it to. So we'll break that connection and connect it to the rotate x. Try that out. It's now rotating in the proper axis, but it's not rotating in the proper direction, nor at the proper speed. So let's fix that. We'll select our multiply divide node and go to our attribute editor. We need to reverse it, so we'll multiply it by a negative value instead, -1 right now. Now it's rotating in the proper axis and in the proper direction, but not at the proper speed. Let's go ahead and select that utility node. And this gear has 16 teeth on it. This one has a 1632, but this is the driver. Let's try a multiplication of -16 on it. And as you can see, everything is now working perfectly. 2, 3. Now, as you can imagine, these setups can get quite complicated. And there are some tools in Maya that will help us better visualize and understand what's going on in our scenes as they get more and more complex. What I'm going to do is come over here to Windows, General Editors, and I'm going to open up the hypergraph connections. And when I open that up, you'll see here's our first gear, and you'll notice that it's actually feeding into these multiply divide nodes that I created. The multiply divide nodes are feeding then into the other gears in our gear setup here. So this is a really great tool for visualizing and figuring out and selecting the different parts of these very complex setups that we can create in Maya. So there you have it. That's how we can use the connection editor and some utility nodes, in this case a multiply divide utility node, in our rigging. On a side note, if this were an actual system of gears, we would probably go in the opposite direction. In other words, it is the worm gear that would have to be driving these other gears, not vice versa like we did in our setup here. For starting to learn how to use the connection editor is to start simply. Perhaps by just creating some polygon primitives. And making some very simple connections with them. For instance, I could take this cone, go to my connection editor, select another object such as this cylinder, load it on the right, and then just start making connections and exploring it and experimenting. So maybe I'll take the cones, rotate, let's say X, and connect it to the cylinder's translate Y value, let's say. So now, if I rotate, you'll see that the rotation for my cone is affecting the translation for the cylinder. So that's a little bit about the connection editor and utility nodes. Thank you for watching.